In this Pioneer Masters draft guide, I will be covering all of the information you need to know before diving into this arena exclusive format. I will be discussing the rotating bonus sheet and how that works, the top commons for each color, archetype overviews for each color pair, combat tricks to be aware of, traps to avoid, combos you can assemble, and more. Kicking things off with the rotating bonus sheet, this is a feature of the format because it is only going to be on MTG Arena, so every 2 weeks there's going to be a different bonus sheet in the set, which means there's going to be one card in each pack that is from that bonus sheet. The first 2 weeks is the Planeswalkers bonus sheet, then is the Spells bonus sheet, and finally is the Devotion bonus sheet. So on the Planeswalker bonus sheet, you can expect to see cards that work with Planeswalkers or even against them. So Oath of Gideon plays well with Planeswalkers. Ruinous Path can kill Planeswalkers, and then Narset Transcendent, of course, is a Planeswalker. So keep that in mind when drafting this bonus sheet. You'll want to have the ability to pressure Planeswalkers and protect Planeswalkers. Next is the Spells bonus sheet. This one just has powerful instants and sorceries. So split cards like Far and Away are going to be in this one. And then, of course, at higher rarities, you get access to really powerful instants and sorceries like Mizium Mortars. So cards that care about casting non-creature spells like Prowess creatures get better in this version. And then finally, there is the Devotion bonus sheet, which cares about creatures with devotion and cards with devotion. So Nylaia's Disciple is an example of a devotion card, and devotion cares about the number of pips that you have of a particular color. So Nylaia's Disciple counts your devotion to green. So the more green pips you have on permanents in play, the higher your devotion count is going to be. And as you go up the rarities, the devotion payoffs get more and more powerful. So keep that in mind when you are drafting these packs, that the bonus sheet is going to have an impact on which cards you're going to want to prioritize. Though there are cards that are going to be in every single one, and so we're going to cover some of the best ones now. In the white top commons at number 1 is Ardenvale Tactician. This is a really nice, efficient, aggressive threat. 2/3 flyer for 3 mana is already solid, and the fact that you have the Dizzying Swoop Adventure tacked on means that you're going to be able to pressure your opponent even more effectively by tapping down their blockers when you need to. So if you play this as a 3-drop, it can attack. And if you play this as a 5-drop of sorts by tapping their blockers and then playing it from the adventure, then that's also really good. And then everywhere in between, you generally can find a way to slot in the card, as it is going to do exactly what you want in your aggressive decks. And you can even target your own creatures with the Dizzying Swoop if you have some heroic triggers, which we'll get to in a moment. Next up is Compulsory Rest. This is a really efficient removal spell. 2 mana can take care of an attacker or a blocker. Sure, they get to sacrifice it down the line and gain some life, but overall, you get a lot of efficiency with this card, and it just does what you need to do for 2 mana. And then at number 3 is Hero of Iroas. This is one of the heroic cards I mentioned, because if you cast a spell that targets it, you put a +1/+1 counter on the Hero of Iroas. If you do this even a single time, you're going to have an overly statted card for the mana you invested into it, and it can even save you mana down the line by making your auras cost 1 less to cast, which is really nice because there are some expensive auras in this set that you will want to play, and even just saving mana on the cheaper auras is also nice. So Hero of Iroas is a very, very nice card to have access to. Next is blue. At number 1 is Essence Scatter. 2 mana to counter a creature is just an efficient rate and lets you trade up on mana quite frequently. In the early turns it's good, in the mid game it's good, and overall it just tends to do what you want to do. Sometimes they're going to cast big non-creature spells, and then Essence Scatter does look a little bit weaker, but generally you're going to be pretty happy putting this in your deck, especially if you can pair it with other instants, so that if you don't find a creature to counter, then you can be happy to just spend your mana on something else, which is definitely something to be aware of when you draft Essence Scatter. And number 2 is Cloudfin Raptor. This is a really, really powerful card to play on turn 1 because it's easy to grow it into a large flyer with only that single mana invested, and that makes it a really potent threat early in the game. And then at number 3 is Philology Archaeologist. It's a nice roadblock early on by being a 0/3 that hopefully got you a card, or even sometimes a 1/4 if you don't actually decide to get the card from milling, or maybe you don't hit one. But overall, Philology Archaeologist is a really nice early creature to play to help fuel your game plan. Sometimes you'll have graveyard synergy that this helps with, and sometimes it'll just help you get a little bit of card advantage while adding to the board state. So overall, a nice card to prioritize. Next is black. At number 1 is Ob Nixilis' Cruelty. This is a nice removal spell that's relatively easy to cast with that single black pip, and -5/5 is enough to kill most most creatures that you care about. There is going to be some creatures that you can't kill, and in those cases, oftentimes you can shrink that creature mid-combat and then block it, which is also a helpful mode on Ob Nixilis' Cruelty, and Exile is certainly a relevant upside on this card. And number 2 is Undead Butler, a card that fills your graveyard for cards that care about that, and also gets you a little bit of card advantage when it dies by being able to get a creature back from your graveyard. It is really nice to be able to sacrifice this sometimes, so it does play well with sacrifice synergies as well, and fills your graveyard for synergies that care about that. So it's just a nice little 2-drop to play in your black decks. And then at number 3 is Silumgar Butcher, a card that can sacrifice Undead Butler because Exploit is a mechanic that lets you sacrifice a creature when it comes into play. They don't always do a great job of explaining what all these mechanics do, but on Arena, you'll be able to click on the cards and it will tell you what they do. But Exploit lets you sacrifice creatures when it comes into play, and so when you exploit your Undead Butler or any other creature, then you can give another creature -3/-3, so you can get a little bit of value, maybe sacrifice your worst creature and kill one of their medium-sized creatures, all attached to a decent-sized body at 5 mana. So just a nice card to have access to. Next is red. At number 1 is Girapur Gearcrafter. This is just a really, really nice card. 3 mana, you get a 2/1 and a 1/1 flyer. It adds to the board, helps you go wide for decks that care about that, and a 1/1 flyer can definitely chip in for good chunks of damage over the course of a game. And also, if you're on the defensive, it gives you 2 blockers. So it pretty much just does everything you want in every red deck. And number 2 is Rimrock Knight. This card only wants to go in aggressive decks because the 2 mana 3/1 can't block, but it does everything you want in an aggressive deck by just allowing you to attack, by just letting you send in your small creatures, give them +2/+, so that they'll trade off, and then you just have a nice sized attacker as well. Rimrock Knight is great. And then at number 3 is Wild Slash. 2 damage to any target for 1 mana is just an efficient way to deal with early creatures, and sometimes even burn your opponent out in the late game when you end up in those situations. Next is green. At number 1 is District Guide. 3 mana for a 2/2, and you can get a basic land card or a gate card, reveal it, and put it into your hand. So you're going to be able to fix your mana, you're going to be able to make sure you hit your land drops, and you just end up a card in this exchange. Sometimes you can even get gates, which you need for gate synergies, which we will cover later. But District Guide, really nice. At number 2 is Gnarlback Rhino. 4 mana for a 4/4 Trampler is already solid, though double green can be a little bit harder to cast. Though, of course, in that bonus sheet that cares about devotion, that can also be an upside, so keep that in mind. But Gnarlback Rhino, 4 mana for a 4/4 trample, and then when you cast a spell that targets it, you draw a card, which is absolutely stellar. Green has punch spells, which we're about to discuss, but also there are auras that you can cast, there are combat tricks, and Gnarlback Rhino just plays so well with those. It can totally snowball the game and really demands an answer from your opponent. So Gnarlback Rhino is fantastic. Then at number 3 is Savage Punch. This is one of those cards I just mentioned that can target your Gnarlback Rhino, but it's also just a really nice removal spell. If you have a creature with power 4 or greater, you can grow your creature and then kill your opponent's creature and get in a big hit, and that's just really, really nice. It is worth noting that this is a fight spell, so you have to make sure that your creature will survive the fight. You don't want to be 2-for-1ing yourself with this effect, but overall, it's really, really strong, and if you have creatures with power 4 or greater, it gets even better. Next up is the color rankings. This does shift slightly depending on the bonus sheet you're playing with, but as a general ranking, red has some really, really good cards, just like every common is pretty solid, and the just depth of power level combined with the fact that they all work well together on that aggressive game plan puts it at number 1. White coming in at number 2, some good removal spells, some really powerful aura synergies going on there. Blue has some solid card quality as well. Just nice cards, nice creatures, some good early game plays. Green has a little bit of a more straightforward game plan. It doesn't have crazy card advantage other than that 4/4 that we just talked about that can maybe snowball your cards if you keep targeting it. But it's just going to be a really nice play some big creatures. It has some mana fixing, things like that with the District Guide that we already discussed as well. But overall, just a pretty solid doing what green does. And then black just has a little bit less depth. It has some good cards for sure, so definitely don't avoid the color or anything like that. But it doesn't necessarily have the same depth as something like red. So these are more of a tiebreaker than anything. If you have a close pick, then you can use these as a tiebreaker. But generally, especially because these will shift a little bit depending on which specific bonus sheet you have, it's just generally best to just draft the color that is the most open and then build a deck from that. Moving on to the archetype overviews. First up is red-white, which is a deck that cares about heroic, going wide, and targeting your own creatures in the process. So Anax and Cymede is perfect for this deck. When you cast a spell that targets it, your creatures get +1/+1 and gain trample until end of turn. That does include the Anax and Cymede itself. and it has first strike, so it's a really good attacker even if you don't target it as a 3-mana 3/2 first strike vigilance. So that's a really good card. If you're able to go wide a little bit, you can buff up all of your creatures, and if you're targeting it, then it just does everything you want. 10th District Legionnaire is another really good card that rewards you for targeting it. It comes in as a haster early in the game, hits really hard, and then when you target it, it gets counters and scries to find you more action. And then Martial Glory is a card that red-white is going to gain access to that other decks can't even play, and it just lets you target multiple creatures with one card. So you give one creature +3/+0, another creature +0/+3. You can target the same creature, but you're not going to be able to get multiple benefits from Annex and Siamede. So if you target Annex and Siamede with both halves of this, it still only counts as targeting it once. But if you have a 10th District Legionnaire and an Annex and Siamede, you can target one mode on each of them and trigger both of them. So that's really cool to have access to in red-white. Definitely an aggressive strategy. Next is Blue-Black, which is a control deck. Dinrova Horror is a great 6-drop. It just comes into play, returns a permanent to its owner's hand, and then makes them discard a card, so it makes up for the fact that it's a 6-drop by getting you a nice little tempo swing and card advantage, which is just what you want in your finisher in your control deck at uncommon. Possessed Scab is a common that's going to get you card advantage, which is really what you're looking for on your 5-mana 3/2. And then Tonebound Lich is a really nice utility piece for these decks. Comes down early, chips in to get you a little bit of life gain, can help you filter through your cards if you are able to attack with it in the mid game, and overall the lifelink can also be helpful. So Blue-Black, definitely a slow controlling deck that cares about having things in the graveyard a little bit for things like Possessed Scab, giving you some options there, but mostly just playing that classic control role. Next is Green-White, which cares a little bit about auras, a little bit about just having big creatures, and a lot about just raw stats. Unflinching Courage, +2/+2, Trample, and Lifelink is one of those auras that just has to be dealt with because the Lifelink means it can't be raced, the Trample means they can't chump the creature, and so if you slap this down on a big creature, you're going to be causing problems for your opponent, especially if that creature is hard to deal with by just blocking because it's just big enough. So a card like Lockstone Smiter is fantastic by just being a 3-mana 4/4, can't be countered, so really wrecks the essence scatter players, and also just is a great place to put like something like an Unflinching Courage. It is a high risk, high reward strategy to put an aura onto your creature, but a lot of the times it can work out if you are able to pressure your opponent sufficiently and make it so that their removal spells, especially their cheap ones that are damage based, aren't able to kill your creatures. And then Selesnya Charm is just a really nice utility piece to have access to. It can be removal if they have a really big creature. It can make you a 2/2, or it can be used as a combat trick. And so that's something that the green-white decks are going to be very happy to have access to. Next is Blue-Red, which is a deck that cares about casting instants and sorceries. Storm Chaser Mage is a stellar 2-drop, comes in, chips in for damage, and can really continue chipping in for damage over the course of the game, and oftentimes able to chip in for even 2 or 3. Nivix Cyclops is a great 3-drop for this deck, because when you are able to cast even just 1 or 2 instants and sorceries in a turn, it hits like a truck, and your opponent has to constantly live in fear of you just attacking, and maybe casting a couple of instants and sorceries. So you have to be able to cast an instant before attacking, but after that is what I mean, being able to cast a couple more, and maybe your opponent gets hit for 10 out of nowhere if you have those cheap instants and sorceries, like the Wild Slash that we covered in red, which is just an instant for 1 red mana. And then Steam Augury is a really nice way to not only cast an instant or sorcery to trigger these cards, but also just keep the gas in the tank and be able to continue casting multiple spells and hopefully triggering your cards many times. So this is just a nice little blue-red spells archetype. Next is Green-Black, which is a deck that cares about the graveyard and value, as Green-Black often does. Nyx Weaver is really nice because during your upkeep, you can mill 2 cards to set up your graveyard synergies. If you get Nyx Weaver into the graveyard, you can exile it to get some value that way by returning a card from your graveyard to your hand. Dreg Mangler is a really nice common in this deck because it has the scavenge ability, which lets you exile it from your graveyard to put counters equal to its power onto another creature. So it's going to be a really nice, effective way to utilize it if you mill it into the graveyard, or just a 3-mana 3/3 haste, which you aren't used to seeing in black-green, but a 3-mana 3/3 haste is just a 3-mana 3/3 haste. It just attacks really hard on turn 3, and in this deck you'll have access to it. And then Catacomb Sifter is a really nice utility piece. Lets you get scries whenever your other creatures die, comes with a Scion token, so you're getting 3/4 worth of stats for 3 mana, and overall it's just a really, really good card and just powerful on its own, and it's going to fit nicely into this deck. Next up is Blue-White, which is a deck that cares about flyers. Thunderclap Wyvern is a really nice flyer as a 4-mana 2/3 that makes your other flyers bigger, so that can definitely set up some trickery or just help you push through a bunch of damage in the skies. Liev Sky Knight is also really good. 3 mana for 3 power in the air is really, really effective when you're trying to attack in the skies, and the fact that it can detain a non-land permanent an opponent controls is really nice. That prevents creatures from attacking or blocking or activating their abilities for a turn. It's another one of those mechanics that they don't explain when you just read it here, but you'll be able to click on the card on Arena to get more insight into that. But it's a really nice delay tactic to help you win races in the skies. And then Azorius Charm is a really nice utility piece to have access to. Giving your creatures lifelink can actually help you win a race. Oftentimes, though, just the 2-mana mode of being able to put an attacking creature on top of its owner's library. Sometimes you'll use it on blocking creatures, but a lot of the times you'll be swinging in the skies and then putting their big creature that they're attacking back with on the ground on top of their deck, and that's really, really effective for just 2 mana. Next is red-green. This is just a classic big creature beatdown deck. Gore Clan Rampager is solid as a 4-mana 4/4, but it really shines when you use the Blood Rush to just give a creature +4/+4 and trample. That pushes through huge amounts of damage, especially combined with a card like Zendikar Incarnate, which can be a 4-mana 6/4 or something in the mid-turns if you already have 6 lands in play or something like that, and then giving that +4/+4 and trample is absolutely devastating. And then you also gain access to the nice utility card of Destructive Revelry, which can kill those problematic enchantments. There's a lot of enchantment creatures in this set and just some general enchantments that you'll want to deal with. There's a couple of artifacts as well, but mostly the enchantments are what you're going to care about. And being able to kill something for an efficient rate and deal 2 damage to them is really, really nice and makes that card worth playing. Next is white-black, which is a deck that cares about sacrificing. Cartel Aristocrat is a nice 2-drop for this deck because you play it and then you just have a nice sacrifice outlet that you can use for free at any time, which if you have some cards that want to die or things that like your opponent targets with a removal spell or things like that, you can just use the Cartel Aristocrat relatively effectively. And protection from a color can also certainly be really annoying for your opponents. Imperious Oligarch is a really nice 2-drop where you get to play it early turns, chip in for damage, and if it ever does die, Afterlife 1 means that when it dies, you'll be able to get a 1/1 flyer, so you give you 2 sacrifice triggers in that way. And then Sin Collector is just a really nice value card, 3 mana for a 2/1, but you get to take an instant or sorcery from your opponent's hand if they have one. So it's not always going to hit, but when you take one of their cards and you're left with a 2/1, you're going to be very happy to have that. And then, of course, you just have that Sin Collector in play to attack, block, sacrifice, any of those things. So it's just a nice little white-black value deck in that way in a lot of the cases. Next is blue-green, which is a ramp deck. Kiora's Follower is really nice. Untap another target permanent is often going to be used to untap lands in the early turns, which attached to a 2-mana 2/2 is pretty good. Urban Evolution is a 5-mana way to not only draw cards, but also ramp you even further. And then Skyrider Elf pays you off if you are able to splash in this archetype, which is often something you'll want to do in your blue-green deck, because you get to the late game, you have cards that are helping you hit your land drops, helping you draw through your deck. And so being able to splash another card is really nice. Or if you just put in a couple of off-color gates or something like that you're using to splash, then Skyrider Elf can be really nice to just be a giant flyer if you're able to cast it for a lot of different colors. Or just a 2-mana 2/2 flyer is also pretty solid on turn 2. Next is black-red, which is just kind of a value-y deck. There's not a crazy amount of synergy going on here other than just playing good cards, getting some value that way. Blood Tithe Harvester, 2-mana 3/2 that can get a blood token, which is already good. You can sacrifice it to kill things. That's good. And overall, Blood Tithe Harvester just doing like nice, rock-solid, mid-rangey things. Swift Warkite is another really good top-end card. You comes into play, you get to bring a creature back into play, a small creature back into play, but still that's a nice value from your graveyard onto the battlefield, and then you get to return it to your hand at the beginning of the next untap step. You're not usually going to want to put a card from your hand into play, but you can, of course, as an option. And Swift Warkite is a nice top-end card. And then Dreadbore is just a 2-mana removal spell that this deck gains access to that other decks aren't really able to use as effectively. 2 mana, kill a creature or Planeswalker, going to be especially effective on that bonus sheet for Planeswalkers, but certainly just a nice card to have access to. And then there is a bonus archetype in this format, which is the Gates archetype. There are Guild Gates in this set, which are tap lands that have the gate type. So it'll just be like a blue-white tap land that is a gate. And then there are cards that care about having gates. So Gatebreaker Ram is a classic example. It gets +1/+1 for each gate you control, and Vigilance and trample if you have 2 or more gates. So if you're playing a bunch of gates in your deck, maybe you can draft them very highly. You get a bunch of gates, and then you just play cards like Gatebreaker Ram as like a 3-mana 6/6 or things like that. Guild Summit will let you draw a bunch of cards when you're playing gates. Gates Ablaze is like a board wipe at uncommon that you get for just being able to play a bunch of gates. And there are other gate payoffs distributed amongst rarities and different colors. But overall, the gates deck is definitely something you can go for. You just have to prioritize mana fixing so you can cast all of your gate payoffs and make sure that you actually have some gate payoffs, because the problem of drafting the gates super aggressively is if you go for all of these guild gates and then you don't get the payoffs, you just wasted a bunch of draft picks on cards that could have been powerful additions to your deck. So keep that balance in mind, but definitely also keep in mind that if you do see one of these cards early, you can try to build around it. Moving on to the combat tricks to be aware of at the common rarity. In white, there is Artful Maneuver, which is +2/+2 until end of turn. It doesn't give any additional things like flying or stuff like that, but it does have Rebound, which means after you cast it, it'll exile, and then you can cast it for free on your next upkeep, which is really nice with the cards that care about being targeted, like that hero we talked about earlier, where it gets extra counters if you target it. So Artful Maneuver can trigger those cards twice. So the first time you use it as a combat trick, and then you get to just use it to like help push through damage. Sajiri Shelter is a really nice card as well. It is a modal double-faced card, so you can play it as a tapped white land, or you can use it as a 2-mana way to give a creature protection from the color of your choice until end of turn, which is nice to be able to do. Mizium Skin is a 1-mana way to give hexproof until end of turn, but you can overload it so to change each instance of target with each. So each creature you control gets hexproof until end of turn and +0/+1 as well. So if you do a big attack or your opponent does a big attack, keep that in mind that maybe they'll be able to give them all +0/+1. Supernatural Stamina, +2/+0, and then the creature comes back into play. So it'll get any death triggers and any enter the battlefield triggers. So that's worth keeping in mind. And then Rimrock Knight, we already discussed, that +2/+0 can definitely keep the attacks flowing. Next is Trapped to Avoid. Rapid Hybridization is first up. This card is very commonly played in Commander, but it's not a card you should be playing in Draft, because if you target your own creature with this to turn one of your creatures into a 3/3, that's a 2-for-1 against you. And if you target your opponent's creatures, a lot of the time, giving them a 3/3 is not going to be a sizable disadvantage compared to the creature they already had. But a lot of the times you're killing like a 3/3 or a 4/4 anyway, and still giving them a 3/3 is not what you want to be doing. So just avoid playing that card. Crypt Incursion, similarly, is a reminder that this set is Pioneer Masters. It is meant to bring cards to MTG Arena that were not there before, so that Pioneer will be a playable format. And so Crypt Incursion is not a card that is seeded for the draft format. It's just put in the set because they need it for Pioneer. Don't put this card in your deck. Exiling creatures and gaining a little bit of life is not going to be worth it. Dark Deal, also not going to be worth it. Discarding all the cards in your hand and then drawing that many cards -1 is just not powerful enough, especially because it's symmetrical. You actually have to invest the mana to cast this card, and then both players get the exact same effect. So you're just down a card in the exchange, and it's not worth playing. Next are some combos you can assemble with just commons and uncommons, just to get the juices flowing and give you an idea of the sorts of things you can do in this format. First up is a classic combo of Heliod's Pilgrim plus Compulsory Rest, or really any other aura, but especially with Compulsory Rest, to turn your 3-mana 1/2 into a card that digs for one of your best removal spells potentially. That's a really nice synergy to be aware of. If you have a Compulsory Rest, Heliod's Pilgrim becomes a lot more valuable for you. Next is the combo between Honored Hydra and Witch's Mark, or really any Embalm creature and a discard outlet. Honored Hydra has Embalm for 3 and a green, which means you can exile it from your graveyard and get a token copy of it. So you can get a 6/6 version, 6/6 Trampler for just 4 mana if you can discard it early in the game. And so if you end up having like a creature to play on turn 3, and then Witch's Mark on turn 2, and then Witch's Mark on turn 3, discard your Honored Hydra on turn 4, you can get a 6/6 Trampler with that Embalm in your red-green decks. Another nice combo to be aware of is Perforos's Emissary with Alpha Authority. So Perforos's Emissary is either a menace creature or can bestow itself onto a creature to give that one +3/+3 and menace. And then Alpha Authority says that a creature has hexproof and can't be blocked by more than one creature. So menace means a creature has to be blocked by multiple creatures, and Alpha Authority says it can't be blocked by more than one creature. And so that just gives the creature unblockable as an end result. And so that's really, really cool upside to have. And a nice little combo. And then finally, there's the combo between Humble Defector and Sacrifice outlets like Nantuko Husk. What you can do is activate the Humble Defector to draw 2 cards targeting your opponent, and with that ability on the stack, sacrifice it to Nantuko Husk, get that little buff to your Husk, and also draw those 2 cards and not give the Humble Defector to your opponent. So keep these sorts of things in mind when drafting. They're definitely fun to assemble. Next is the mana fixing available in this set at common and colorless. We see the Guild Gates, which we already discussed. They're tap lands. There's one for each color pair, so there are 10 of them. There's also another gate, Gateway Plaza. This one is much worse because you have to spend mana when it comes into play, but it can tap for any color. There is Evolving Wilds, which is premium fixing. Definitely nice to have access to that in this set. And then there's Darksteel Ingot as a bit of a weaker mana fixing. 3 mana to get a mana rock is not generally the best. And then Pilgrim's Eye as a 1/1 flyer that also gets you a basic land is really nice fixing as well. There's also some more situational fixing. So District Guide, as we already discussed, is great fixing, but you have to be playing green to play it. It will be hotly contested. Courier's Briefcase is a treasure, so you can sacrifice it to add 1 mana of any color. So it's like one-shot fixing. So if you have like one card you really need to splash and you're playing green and you're willing to just invest in just playing a Courier's Briefcase, which might be a little bit less powerful in your deck if you aren't able to use its other abilities, but it does give you some one-shot fixing. And then Halo Scarab is also a little bit of one-shot fixing. If you can get it to your graveyard, you can exile it to get a treasure, but definitely don't rely on that as fixing consistently because it does have some hoops to jump through, but as a supplemental source of mana fixing, keep that in mind as well. Moving on to some final tips, I did want to mention one mechanic in particular. Bestow is a very complex mechanic, especially if you've never played with it, but it's also incredibly powerful. So if you've never played with Bestow, basically the way that it works is you can target your creature with your Bestow by paying the Bestow cost. So it basically turns your creature into an aura. But if the creature then dies, the aura doesn't go to the graveyard with it. The bestowed creature just falls off and becomes a creature. Also worth noting, if the creature that you're targeting with your Bestow card it gets killed in response, the Bestow creature still comes into play. So Boon Satyr is really, really powerful, where if I am going to attack my opponent and I go for my Bestow for 5 mana to try and win the combat, and they like try to blow me out, quote unquote, with a removal spell, the Boon Satyr will still come into play as a 4/2 because it will just be like, oh, I can't attach as an aura, I'll come into play. Or I use it to trade in combat or something like that. So I bestow it onto my creature, it gets +4/+2. That creature trades, Boon Satyr then becomes a 4/2. So it's a little bit complicated if you've never played with it before. There are a lot of mechanics in this set because it is a reprint set, so I wasn't able to go through every single mechanic. But Bestow is powerful enough and also confusing enough if you've never played with it before that I thought it deserved this little bit of extra explanation. So just keep that in mind. The way it works, you can bestow your card onto your creature with generally no fear, because if they kill it in response, you'll still get the underlying creature. Now, sometimes you spent a lot of mana, and so it's still not necessarily the best to get like quote unquote blown out, but it is still worth noting that you will get to keep the creature part, and then if the creature that was enchanted dies, then you'll get the creature into play from the enchantment essentially falling off and just becoming a creature. So keep that in mind. And then the final tip is modal double-faced cards are great additions to your deck to help prevent flood. So they might not look the most powerful on the surface. So a card like Akoum Warrior, which is a 6 mana 4/5 trample, is not the best. But the fact that you can play it as a tapped red source when you just need lands is very, very powerful. So if you have a situation where have a deck that has normally 17 lands and 23 spells, you're going to just sometimes flood out, sometimes not have enough lands. But if you have a deck that has, say, 22 spells and then 2 modal double-faced cards, then you can have then 16 lands, and then you are slightly less likely to flood because you'll have these expensive cards you can play in the late game. So you have like 24 spells essentially for those situations, but also you have like essentially 18 lands for the early turns where you really need mana. So these double-faced cards are really powerful and definitely worth prioritizing for your decks, even if they don't look the most powerful on the surface when you first read them. Anyway, that's going to do it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Good luck in your drafts. If you did make it to the end, be sure to hit the thumbs up button, subscribe for more, and leave hashtag #PioneerDrafter in the comments section down below to let me know you made it all the way to the end, along with your questions, thoughts, and feedback, of course. That's going to do it for this one, though. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you next time.